No, not really. You take precautions. You do what you have to do to make sure you protect yourself. But at the end of the day, I still have my voice." Whitney said those words calmly, almost casually, as she reflected on the pressure of reaching that third album. She even agreed with Tina Turner that the third record is always the hardest. On the surface, it sounded like any confident superstar answering any ordinary question. But beneath that composure lived a story most people were never meant to hear. Everyone thinks they know Whitney Houston's life. The fame, the fall, the tragedy, the mugshots, and the memes. The documentaries and the interviews. But behind those headlines is a different narrative, a quieter, darker file that the music industry has spent decades trying to keep sealed. Because Whitney didn't just battle addiction, pressure, or a broken marriage. She battled someone, not a scandal, not a rumor, a man. A man powerful enough to design her rise and dark enough, according to some people who were closest to her, to slowly crush her spirit. A man she trusted, feared, relied on. A man some insiders quietly believe was the only person Whitney may have truly, deeply hated. It wasn't Bobby. It wasn't the tabloids. It wasn't the people the world still loves to blame when her name comes up. This was someone higher up, someone shielded by power. Someone so protected that even today, mentioning his name can turn a roomful of fans into a battlefield. And once you follow the actual timeline of Whitney's life, every argument, every collapse, every desperate attempt to pull free, you start to see a chilling pattern. All roads, sooner or later, lead back to him. Tonight, we open that file. We trace the decisions, the silences, the fractures, and we ask why. In the end, Whitney Houston may have felt there was one man she could never forgive. Whitney Houston entered the world in the summer of 1963 in Newark, New Jersey. A city still shaking from poverty, unrest, and the aftershocks of racial tension. But inside the modest East Orange home where she grew up, the pressure was even more intense, more personal. From the moment Whitney could form words, she could form melodies. By the time she was 4, members of New Hope Baptist Church were whispering that her voice didn't sound like it belonged to a child at all. It sounded borrowed, like something on loan from heaven. But in the Houston household, a heavenly gift didn't guarantee comfort. In that house, safety was not the reward. Perfection was. Under the strict, unwavering gaze of her mother, Sissy Houston, Whitney was never treated as just a little girl with a special talent. She was handled like a vessel with an assignment. Every note was monitored, every breath had to be disciplined, every slight mistake seemed to carry consequences. When Whitney sang beautifully, no one was surprised. That was simply the standard. When she slipped, even slightly, the atmosphere changed. The room didn't explode. It froze. The silence turned sharper, heavier. Whitney learned early that approval could vanish, and that love, or what felt like it, was something you earned through flawless performance. The walls of that home pulsed with gospel music, yet underneath the harmonies was a quiet, unsettling dread, the sense that one wrong step could disappoint the person she admired most. By her early teens, Whitney understood the central rule that governed her childhood like law. In this family, you weren't allowed to be average. You weren't allowed to be exhausted. You weren't allowed to be simply human. You were required to be extraordinary. Anything less felt like failure. That rule etched itself into Whitney's spirit so deeply that she carried it long after she left New Jersey. It followed her onto stages, into hotel rooms, into interviews, into marriages, and into the darkest corners of her adult life. The first crack in her foundation didn't appear under the glare of cameras. It formed quietly in that house, in the shadow of impossible expectations. That fracture would eventually split wide open, becoming the catastrophe the world still tries and fails to fully understand. Before the spotlight overwhelmed her, before executives and handlers claimed ownership over her time, there was one person who made Whitney feel completely safe. Only one. Losing that person didn't just hurt, it changed the direction of her entire life. This is the chapter the world was never supposed to read. The chapter that began the day Robin Crawford stepped into her story. Whitney and Robin met in the late summer of 1980. Whitney was still just a 17-year-old girl, trying to outrun the shadows of East Orange and the expectations that wrapped themselves around her like chains. The air was thick and heavy with New Jersey heat, the kind that made pavement shimmer and turned bus rides into slow, sticky journeys. Whitney was working at the East Orange Community Center, drained from juggling school, church rehearsals, family demands, and the relentless responsibility of being the girl with the voice. Then Robin walked in, tall, self-possessed. Eyes sharp enough to see past the polished mask Whitney had been forced to wear since childhood. Their connection wasn't some dramatic romance or mystical moment. It was something more dangerous in Whitney's world, something real. Robin didn't care about the voice that everyone else worshipped. She cared about the young woman behind it. In a life where Whitney was treated like a promise, Robin treated her like a person. That alone made her a threat. By 1981, the two were rarely seen apart. They rode buses together, shared late-night conversations on long walks home, spoke dreams out loud about lives that felt bigger than the streets they grew up on. Robin quickly became Whitney's shield, especially when it came to the suffocating expectations inside the Houston family. When Whitney broke down after one of her mother's harsh critiques, it was Robin who stayed awake with her until dawn. When Whitney questioned her own worth, it was Robin who whispered, "You are enough, even when they tell you you're not." She didn't worship Whitney's perfection. She comforted her imperfections. But the music industry has never been kind to anyone who gets too close to its most valuable assets. Whitney Houston was about to become the brightest diamond the business had ever cut. And diamonds, to the people who profit from them, are not supposed to come with protectors who can say no. By 1985, Whitney's debut album had detonated across the charts. #1 singles, sold-out shows, television specials, magazine covers. With success came something no one could escape: scrutiny. Reporters started asking about the mysterious woman always at Whitney's side. Photographers zoomed in on the moments when Whitney leaned in too close, laughed too hard, or held Robin's gaze a little too long. Fans gossiped. Relatives whispered. Executives grew anxious. To the people managing her image, Whitney had to remain untouched, pure, perfect, universally beloved. Nothing about her public life could appear too intimate, too emotional, too complicated. And in their eyes, that meant Robin needed to disappear from the frame. One of the moments that shook Whitney didn't happen on stage or in a press conference. It played out in private, away from microphones and cameras, the kind of moment no one was ever supposed to hear about. According to individuals who later spoke off the record, on the 14th of November, 1987, inside a back office at Arista Records in Manhattan, Whitney was quietly pulled aside after a routine meeting about her upcoming tour dates. Behind a closed door, two executives allegedly sat her down. They spoke politely, professionally. There were smiles, but not the kind that reached their eyes. Whitney was told that, as her brand grew, her inner circle needed to align with that brand. No one said Robin's name. They didn't have to. The message was clear. Robin needed to step back. Whitney didn't scream. She didn't argue. She listened. She nodded. Then she walked out, stepped into the elevator, and rode down alone, shaking, staring at her reflection in the mirrored walls as if she didn't recognize the woman staring back. That quiet, tactical attempt to remove the one person she trusted most left a wound that, by many accounts, never truly healed. But the interference didn't end there. When Whitney's connection with Bobby Brown ignited in 1989, the pressure surrounding Robin intensified. Bobby was flame volatile, magnetic, combustible. Robin was stone, steady, grounded, fiercely devoted. They were opposites in every way, and their presence around Whitney turned into a kind of silent war. Crew members would later describe the atmosphere as dangerous and electric, like two storms forming over the same ocean. There were no punches thrown, no public brawls. But anyone who has ever walked into a room charged with unspoken hostility knows you don't need fists for damage. There were cold stares, tight jaws, doors closed a little too hard, arguments held behind dressing room walls, thick enough to muffle sound, but not enough to hide tension. According to people who were there, Robin believed Bobby would eventually destroy Whitney. Bobby believed Robin was the one controlling Whitney. Whitney, caught between the two, believed she could hold on to both. but not even Whitney Houston could keep that triangle from collapsing. By the early 1992, the feud had turned solid, like concrete. Tour managers quietly separated responsibilities to keep Bobby and Robin away from each other. Staff formed alliances. Even the band could feel the divide. Whitney, already stretched thin by superstardom, tried to act as referee. Every time she stepped in to calm things down, she paid for it emotionally. Robin became the quiet half of her soul, constant, loyal, familiar. Bobby became the wildfire she couldn't resist, the chaos that made her feel free. Whitney loved them both, differently but intensely, and that love was tearing her apart. In the end, one of them had to leave. And the decision, in many ways, wasn't made by Whitney. It was made by the world around her. The final break didn't arrive with a dramatic showdown. There was no screaming in hallways, no public meltdown, no teary televised goodbye. One day, Robin was simply gone. She left her position on the security detail, left the tour operation, left the backstage corridors where her presence once meant safety, and eventually she left Whitney's day-to-day life. Whitney pretended it didn't destroy her. She smiled, she laughed, she hit the notes, she walked red carpets. But those who knew her noticed the shift. Her eyes seemed dimmer, silences stretched longer. The space around her felt colder. Losing Robin didn't just mean losing a friend. It meant losing oxygen. Robin hadn't just been someone in Whitney's orbit. She had been the only person who consistently protected Whitney the way Whitney instinctively protected everyone else. From the moment Robin walked away, Whitney's slow descent truly began, not because Robin caused the fall, but because she had been the last stabilizing force holding Whitney together. The industry believed that pushing Robin out would make Whitney stronger, more manageable, more marketable. Instead, it left her exposed alone in crowded rooms, surrounded by people who wanted her talent but did not love her the way Robin did. She was drowning inside a success other people envied. This wasn't the end of Whitney's story. It was the start of her unraveling. And somewhere in the background, a man Whitney would one day carry the deepest resentment toward, a man whose name would haunt the closing chapters of her life, was already watching her rise from the shadows, waiting for the exact moment he could shape her destiny. The story of Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown was never soft, never gradual. It didn't ease into existence. It detonated. Their worlds crashed together backstage at the 1989 Soul Train Music Awards, in a space already thick with lights, noise, and famous faces. Even in a room filled with stars, the energy around them was different, almost volatile. Whitney, America's polished pop princess, moved like royalty, gliding through a universe that demanded grace and control. Bobby, on the other hand, carried himself like a walking disruption, raw, unpredictable, magnetic in a way that made handlers nervous. Their first real conversation felt less like a chat and more like collision. Two storms recognizing each other. According to people who were there, you could feel instantly that whatever this connection was, it would not be quiet, safe, or easy. Whitney had spent her entire life being molded. Every gesture softened, every answer considered, every instinct filtered through the lens of what was acceptable. Bobby didn't treat her like a delicate image. He teased her, challenged her, argued with her, talked to her like she was not an untouchable icon, but a woman who could joke, flirt, and want things she had never been allowed to say out loud. For someone who had been controlled since childhood, that chaos felt like freedom. By the time 1990 rolled in, the pull between them had grown so strong that the people around them could only watch and brace for whatever came next. As the relationship intensified, so did the conflict with the carefully crafted Whitney Houston brand. Executives were alarmed. To them, Bobby represented a sound, a scene, and a lifestyle that clashed with the soft, angelic crossover image they had spent years perfecting. New Jack Swing collided with pristine pop. The contrast terrified the people managing her career. The press smelled weakness before any real damage appeared. Tabloids circled like vultures, asking loaded questions about arguments, jealousy, and differences in their worlds. Gossip columns hinted at chaos long before the public saw any cracks. Industry whispers predicted disaster. And yet, Whitney held on to Bobby with a kind of stubborn devotion. Raised her whole life to obey, to deliver, to play the role others wrote for her, she clung to him as if he were her one chance to feel unscripted. The early years of their love were a storm, intimate, wild, and unstable. Friends would later recall nights when the two of them laughed so loudly that hotel walls seemed to shake. Other nights, crew members heard voices raised just enough to warn anyone in the hallway to keep walking. Their wedding in July 1992 didn't calm the storm. It intensified it. Fans expected a fairy tale union, a picture of glamour and devotion. Instead, what the public got was a string of headlines that hinted at something far more troubled. Whitney's once spotless image began to fray at the edges. She arrived late to rehearsals. She canceled shows unexpectedly. She appeared in interviews and on stage with a jittery restlessness that makeup, gowns, and good lighting couldn't fully hide. At the 1994 American Music Awards, she delivered a performance that her fans adored. The crowd saw power and perfection, but insiders claimed that backstage, moments before she stepped out into the lights, there had been tension involving Bobby sharp enough to rattle even a seasoned performer like Whitney. The media sharpened its knives. Every move was dissected, every stumble became ammunition. But the most dangerous war she was fighting wasn't playing out in headlines. It was unfolding behind closed doors, inside her personal life. The triangle between Whitney, Bobby, and Robin Crawford turned her world into a battlefield. Robin, who had defended and grounded her for years, watched as Bobby's influence grew. Backstage spaces that once felt stable now felt divided. According to tour staff, the atmosphere became so tense that simply walking into the wrong room at the wrong time could trigger a confrontation. Bobby believed Robin undermined him. Robin believed Bobby destabilized Whitney. Whitney still believed she could keep both pillars standing through sheer force of will, but both pillars were already cracking. One particularly charged night during Whitney's 1993 World Tour in Washington, D.C., would later be described by team members as a turning point. Reports say Bobby confronted a staff member connected to Robin, accusing them of working against him. Robin pushed back, furious, protective, unafraid. The argument escalated so quickly that security had to physically step in. Whitney, hearing fragments of raised voices down the corridor, left her dressing room with her makeup half done. She walked out into a hallway humming with hostility and found the two people she trusted most locked in a private war no spotlight could fix. She didn't scream. She withdrew. According to one witness, she went back to her dressing room and cried quietly for nearly an hour. Then she wiped her face, fixed her makeup, and walked on stage as if nothing had happened. The show went on. The wound stayed. The strain from the Bobby-Robin conflict didn't just bruise Whitney's heart. It altered her presence, the way she carried her shoulders, the way her laughter sounded. Even the way she sang began to feel heavier, like every note was dragging something unseen behind it. She was burning from both ends, tethered to Bobby out of love and rebellion, tethered to Robin out of loyalty and memory, and losing parts of herself in the constant effort to keep the peace. By 1994, the tension was unbearable. Arguments between Whitney and Bobby spilled closer to public view. Paparazzi photos captured stiff body language, clenched jaws, and cold distance at airports and events where Whitney once appeared warm and relaxed. Robin stayed as long as she could. She did her job. She kept her word. She tried to wait out the storm, hoping things would settle, hoping Whitney would find her balance again. But the environment grew more hostile. She was increasingly isolated, pushed aside professionally by people who stood firmly in Bobby's corner, scrutinized by outsiders, and quietly devastated as Whitney drifted into a world she couldn't follow without breaking herself. When Robin finally stepped away, leaving Whitney's orbit with a mixture of grief and resignation, the exit didn't make headlines. There were no statements, no press releases, just absence. Whitney felt it like an echo that never stopped. Those close to her said something in her shifted. The loss didn't explode, it rang hollow. She loved Bobby deeply, wildly, and sometimes destructively. But she also knew, whether she said it out loud or not, that she had lost the one stable force her adult life had known, and she still could not bring herself to let Bobby go. Instead, she gripped him tighter, hoping the intensity of their love would fill the hollow space Robin left behind. It didn't. It widened it. By the late 1990 seconds, Whitney's life resembled a maze. Missed interviews, canceled shows, troubling photographs, and headlines that began to frame her not as an invincible superstar, but as a legend slipping into a battle she was losing. Bobby wasn't the cartoon villain the media tried to paint. He had his own struggles, his own flaws, his own history. But he was undeniably a catalyst, a presence that heightened her vulnerabilities, sped up her exhaustion, and pulled her deeper into a lifestyle that drained her year after year. Still, Whitney didn't say she hated him. She didn't frame him as the enemy. What she felt for Bobby was more complex than any tabloid story could capture. Love tangled with fear, loyalty knotted with exhaustion, passion fused with hurt. He wasn't the man she despised. He was the man she kept trying to survive. And while her marriage spun further into cycles of conflict, dependence, and emotional wear, another presence, colder, more powerful, less visible, began to loom larger in the background. This wasn't a spouse or a childhood friend. This was someone whose influence reached beyond gossip columns and public scandals. A man who had been there from the beginning. A man woven into the architecture of her career. The man, Whitney Houston, according to many observers and fans, would one day carry her deepest resentment toward. Long before Whitney Houston's marriage started to fall apart in front of cameras, long before her life was turned into late-night punchlines and tabloid fodder, there was something colder at work behind her. A system, a quiet machine. Executives, producers, managers, publicists, media gatekeepers, all of them orbiting the same objective: protect the Whitney Houston brand at any cost. These people were not lovers or family. They were architects and gatekeepers, the ones who saw Whitney not as a young woman trying to survive global fame, but as a product, high value, high risk, and expected to perform flawlessly on command. From the mid-1980 seconds, as her debut album shattered records, the pressure around her didn't just increase, it solidified into something suffocating. Every magazine cover, every TV performance, every award show appearance came with an invisible checklist. Whitney had to be pristine, approachable, marketable, non-controversial, above all, perfect. One misquote could shift a narrative. One tired appearance could spark rumors that she was slipping. When Whitney saw headlines mocking her weight, questioning her authenticity, or debating whether she was too white or not black enough, the words didn't bounce off her. They sank in. Image wasn't just part of the job anymore. It became a cage. Behind that polished image, the men overseeing her career pulled the bars of that cage closer with each milestone. Her schedule was assembled by people who spoke in terms of projections and quarterly plans, not feelings. Producers fine-tuned her sound based on formulas they trusted more than her instincts. Publicists coached her through interviews, right down to which expressions played best on camera. Even the songs she recorded were filtered through a lens of marketability. It wasn't, "What does Whitney want to sing?" It was, "What will sell?" She began to notice how rarely anyone in those rooms asked a simple question: "What do you want?" As the years passed, the strain deepened. Whitney made small attempts to push back requests for a break, for more creative control, for the chance to lean harder into the gospel and R&B that had shaped her soul as a child. Time and again, she reportedly met resistance. The words were polite, the tone respectful, but the message remained clear. The Whitney Houston machine was moving, and she was not allowed to slow it down. The media intensified that pressure tenfold. If she appeared tired, they said she was fading. If she pushed back on a question, she was labeled difficult. If she tried to retreat from the public eye, cameras simply followed her into airports, hotels, and parking lots. Public scrutiny and private control fused into a vice that tightened so slowly it was almost invisible until Whitney couldn't recognize the woman looking back at her in the mirror. She wasn't just performing on stage anymore. She was performing every second she was in public. The smile, the posture, the polished responses, the discipline, they weren't just personality traits, they were armor. People close to her would later describe this era as a tug-of-war living inside one person. Whitney felt gratitude toward those who elevated her to unimaginable heights. At the same time, she felt a growing resentment toward the same people for reducing her existence to a role she had to play. There were no dramatic confrontations, no scenes out of a movie. The tension lived in tiny moments. A look across a conference table, a request denied, a decision made about her life without her blessing. The people around her may not have intended to break her, but by treating her like an untouchable icon instead of a woman in need of care, they left her more isolated, more exhausted, and increasingly unsure of her value beyond her voice. By the time the 1,990 seconds took hold, Whitney was surrounded by bodies but starved of connection. The executives wanted perfection, the press wanted chaos, and Whitney, unable to satisfy both gods, started slipping through the cracks before anyone truly acknowledged she was falling. When Robin Crawford left, the exit didn't come with drama. It arrived with absence, silence. The one person who had seen Whitney the woman, not just Whitney the legend, was no longer there to steady her. Bobby Brown remained, but Bobby carried his own storms. His public arrests, controversies, and emotional volatility bled into Whitney's already fragile world. Instead of becoming each other's safe place, they often swung away from one another, crashing back together with the force of two wounded people colliding over and over. Their love was real tender in private moments, explosive in others, but it was played out under the harshest light possible. The world watched, misread, and judged every second of it. Whitney tried to hold everything together, but no matter how strong the glue is, it can't hold if both pieces are already cracking. Her family, from the outside, looked like a support system, a sanctuary. But behind closed doors, it was more complicated. Tension threaded through those relationships. Financial stress, emotional expectations, arguments about Bobby, arguments about Robin, arguments about Whitney's health and choices. Some relatives worried desperately about her well-being. Others worried about the family's image and stability. Some urged her to slow down, to rest, to regroup. Others encouraged her to keep working, to keep the machine alive. Whitney, longing for unconditional love, found herself instead managing other people's fears, reputations, and needs. Her own needs were rarely at the center. The media grew crueler as the decade unfolded. When she canceled concerts or appeared physically diminished, tabloids mocked her. When rumors surfaced about her struggles, late-night hosts turned them into jokes. Whisper campaigns spread through the industry, treating her pain like a spectacle to consume. Even in moments of triumph award wins, fiery performances, emotional comebacks, commentators zoomed in on imperfections. Was her voice weaker? Did she look thinner? Was something wrong? Whitney wasn't just being watched. She was being hunted. She absorbed all of it, every accusation, every rumor, every punchline. Whitney had once believed that if she just sang hard enough, if she poured enough soul into a performance, she could outrun anything that scared her. The stage had been her escape, the one place she could breathe. But by the late 1,990 seconds, even the stage began to feel like another courtroom where she was on trial. Her voice, once effortless, now carried the weight of expectation. Every high note felt like a question. Is she still the Whitney we remember? Every performance felt like a test she might fail. And with each doubt, the rumor mill spun faster. She started to withdraw. She stopped appearing at certain events. When she did show up, the smiles looked tighter, like they'd been pressed into place. Friends described her as distant. Staff members called her fragile. Even Bobby, in rare, clear moments, seemed to recognize that Whitney was unraveling faster than anyone could admit out loud. At one point, she reportedly confided to someone close, "I feel like everybody wants something from me, but nobody sees me." It didn't come out as anger, it came out as truth. She was giving herself away in pieces. To fans, to family, to the industry, to the man she loved, until there was almost nothing left for her own survival. The pressure that had followed her since childhood now pressed harder than ever. Fame turned into a weapon, love turned into confusion, loneliness turned into a habit she wore every day. In that loneliness, Whitney began mentally revisiting the entire cast of her life. The people who built her, the ones who depended on her, the ones who walked away, the ones who stayed and watched. She replayed her career like a timeline, and, along with the triumphs, she saw other patterns: manipulation, control, silence, fear. One truth grew clearer. The world worshipped Whitney Houston, the icon. Very few people had truly cared for Whitney Houston, the human being. As her world grew smaller and her shadows stretched longer, another presence quietly came back into focus. A man who had been there from the first moment she stepped into the industry. A man she owed her rise to, yet whose influence would become increasingly tangled in her pain. A man the public respected, celebrated, even revered, while some fans over time began to whisper that he might be the one person she could never truly forgive. His name was Clive Davis. Clive Davis stepped into Whitney Houston's life the way a major character steps into a legend, quietly at first, but with a presence that would reshape everything that followed. It was 1983, in a small New York City club, the kind of dim, smoky room where aspiring singers poured their hearts into microphones, hoping that someone with power might be listening. Whitney walked on stage that night in a simple dress, hair pulled back, aura unpolished but undeniable. She was not yet a global icon, just a young woman carrying a voice that felt too big for the space around her. When she began to sing, the atmosphere inside the room changed. Conversations cut off. Glasses hovered midair. Even the servers slowed down, leaning against walls just to listen. Clive Davis, already